Ross Chastain showed at the end of today's race that sometimes it's the moves you don't make that lead to the best results. How's it going, y'all? My name is Eric. Welcome to Out of the Groove Talladega Race Review Edition. Oh man, I'm in a good mood. I picked Ross Chastain to win twice this year on our Wednesday night NASCAR Weekly Podcast live stream. And both times I've picked him, he's come home with the victory. First at Circuit of the Americas, today at Talladega as well. We're going to talk all about Ross Chastain. We'll talk about the top finishers, some of the big spectacular wrecks. I also want to talk about Dale Earnhardt Jr. joining the Fox broadcast booth because I thought he brought a ton of great enthusiasm and insight to this Talladega coverage. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button. We react to races every week. We talk NASCAR news. We've got a lot to talk about Monday this week and much more. We also have drivers on the show pretty frequently, so hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes. Let's get started, as we typically do, with the finish. I want to give a shout out to my boy Eric Jones. I've been saying for a couple of years now that Eric Jones is the most underrated super speedway racer in the game right now. He won 2 plate races with JGR. I know one was the Clash when his car was half destroyed, but then he's come over to Petty and he's been in contention pretty much every super speedway race. Led 25 laps today, was leading on the white flag, despite not having any teammates up there with him. His only teammate, Ty Dillon, had wrecked out way earlier. He spent all day up front, was leading coming out of turn 4, and then just got a little too far ahead of the pack. Kyle Larson got a huge run, Ross Chastain pushing him, Kurt Busch with a big run, Larson moves up, gets hooked by Kurt Busch, didn't realize the 45 was already out there. Jones, I got suckered into making maybe an ill-advised block in hindsight. Can't really blame him in the moment for moving up, but obviously now knowing how much of a run the inside lane had, he probably wish he'd stayed down there in front of Chastain, considering Larson basically messed himself up by turning himself across the nose of the 45. It was typical Talladega chaoticness in the final few hundred yards. A couple drivers got serious damage. Bubba Wallace seemed a little shaken up when he first got out of his car, but appeared to be okay. Poor Corey LaJoie got cleaned out by Michael McDowell as well. Might have snuck into the top 10. I'm not exactly sure, so that's too bad. In many ways, this was a typical Talladega race. Lots of 2 and 3 wide racing, a few pretty big, gnarly wrecks earlier in the afternoon, some train racing in stage 3, green flag pit stop strategy and coordination between manufacturers and teammates, and obviously the finish was chaotic. Lots of runs, 3 and 4 wide, a mad scramble there through the tri-oval. But the one kind of unique element of this Talladega race was the fact that Ross Chastain, an aggressive driver historically speaking, won this race by not making a big, bold move there in the final few hundred meters. Now, in the final couple laps, he did try to put a block on Kurt Busch and almost wrecked himself in the 45, but kept things straight. So he did get a little squirrely there on the last lap, but when it mattered most in the home stretch, he stayed pretty much hugged to that bottom line, was pushing Kyle Larson, was getting pushed by, I think, Austin Dillon behind him, and rode that momentum all the way to the finish. As he said over his radio, kind of jokingly, like, I didn't even do anything. They all just went high. Sometimes it's the moves you don't make. And that's what I've talked about on this show regarding past super speedway races where we've seen fiery crashes at the finish, usually due to the leader or someone up front making a late or ill-advised block. I've shown you all examples of like Denny Hamlin, one of the best super speedway racers in the business, not making the crazy block at the end of the 2020 Daytona 500. Obviously circumstances in front of him, Blaney and Newman wrecking, but he ended up winning that race because he didn't make the risky late block. Sometimes you have to make a block, but sometimes you don't. That was the case today. And again, if Eric Jones doesn't try to block Larson, he wins this race. So obviously so much is happening all at once. It's difficult for the spotter to relay information to the driver who really only has a clear view out their windshield. You can't always fault the guy for making a late block, but sometimes it's extremely predictable. Credit to Ross Chastain, an aggressive race car driver, winning it cleanly, more or less tonight. Didn't make the aggressive move, didn't make the bold move and set off the big wreck. He just rode that double yellow line and kept his foot in it. Now, Chastain did make some aggressive moves early in the race that nearly caused wrecks, like when he blended up into the 2 and 3 wide pack when he was going a lap down. I mean, it worked out for him. He ended up getting the lucky dog shortly thereafter, but that made my heart stop. Chastain's an aggressive race car driver. He was my pick coming into this weekend, partially because of that aggression, but because this year we've seen him channel that aggression into wins and top 3 finishes. You remember he had like 4 straight finishes inside the top 3. He won that race at Circuit of the Americas because he refused to get pushed around by AJ Allmendinger. Today, he didn't really have to push anybody around, but he was aggressive and held that car just straight enough to get it done. Congratulations to Ross Chastain and Trackhouse. This is a huge week for Trackhouse. They announced Jockey, I think about a week ago, as a new associate sponsor. They're going to be the primary for a few races later this year. Then earlier today, they announced Worldwide Express as a major new partner for both Chastain and Suarez. And then they go out and win their second race of the year, the second race in the company's young history. Last year, I called them the most interesting team in NASCAR. They're brand new. They brought in Justin Marks, Ty Norris, Pitbull. But this year, now with 2 wins, they are the most impressive team in NASCAR. Even Daniel Suarez led laps early on until he was caught up in one of the first big wrecks. So even he had some pretty good speed, just wrong place, wrong time. Melons were smashed. Trackhouse goes home happy. Congratulations again to Ross Chastain, becoming the second 2-time winner this season, joining William Byron. Before we move on, let's look at some of the other top finishers. It's a super speedway, so I'm sure we're going to see some unique names up here. Ah, yes, 4th place, Kyle Larson? The Kyle Larson finishing top 5 at a super speedway? With all 4 fenders mostly on the car? Wow. Wow, that is like the upset of the year. I'm just kidding around, and obviously Larson had a shot at the win there, got up into the 45 in the home stretch, but a great day for Larson and a great day overall for Chevrolet, Hendrick Motorsports especially. Byron won stage 2. Actually, I think Hendrick Motorsports, they didn't finish 1 through 3, 4. I think they finished like 1, 2, 3, 5 or something in stage 2. But Chevy was fast all day long, and honestly, so was Toyota. All 4 Joe Gibbs Racing cars were up near the front at some point or another, often working together. The 2 2311 cars of Kurt Busch and Bubba Wallace really impressed. We expected Bubba to be fast. He was last year. He won the last Talladega race. But Kurt Busch as well was up in contention up until the very end right there. So all of the 6 main Toyota drivers and cars were very, very fast today. Ford, who was so fast back at Speed Week in Daytona, they were kind of a no-show today. Like, Blaney got the lead late, thanks in part to some pit strategy, but even then, after the final cycle of green flag stops, Blaney fell back and couldn't work his way forward. I know Ford lost some numbers early on, but they didn't qualify well. Logano, who started 13th, was the best qualifying Ford. And then they didn't seem to race that well early on, or maybe by design they were trying to hang in the back. It didn't work, because a lot of them got caught up in wrecks. Logano, of course, on that one restart got jacked up when Truex kind of slowed down a little bit. I can't remember who was directly behind Truex. Somebody. And then there was Logano, who was pushing him, who then got pushed by Bubba and got spun out of line and wrecked. So I understand that some of the fast Ford drivers, Logano's usually up front at super speedways, they got damage early on. And Keselowski had a couple speeding penalties today, my goodness. But even before those issues came up, Ford just was not very good today, which I was surprised. Typically, Fords are great at super speedways. They really weren't today. I think both Chevy and Toyota were better. I mean, look at this. The best finishing Ford was Michael McDowell in 8th. Hey, Corey LaJoie still got a top 15 despite being spun there at the very end. A few other drivers I want to point out. Eric Jones again led the final portion of this race, was up front all day long. Lost the lead on the front stretch, but he still gets a very solid 6th place. I still think Eric Jones has a chance of pointing his way into the playoffs. He's already had a top 5 once this year at a non-super speedway. He can do it again. A win would have gone a long way, don't get me wrong. It would have practically locked him into the playoffs, but points are points, and 6th is very solid. Austin Dillon snuck into 2nd there. He was pushing Chastain. He was up near the front most of the race. I feel like I kept seeing him and Truex, the 2 Bass Pro cars, next to each other inside the top 10, so good for him. His teammate Tyler Reddick had an engine issue very early on. We had a few Chevys with engine issues, including Daniel Hemrick, who lost an engine in the middle of the pack and sparked off one of the first big crashes. Chase Briscoe got some heavy damage. Hope he's okay, because he took a couple big hits there up into the wall, and Chris Buescher. A few other finishers of note. Joe Gibbs Racing Toyotas of Kyle Busch, Martin Truex Jr. both get top 5s. A little further down, actually just outside the top 15, Kurt Busch, who was in contention for the win, ends up 16th across the line. Hendrick's still fairly represented here in the top 15. All 4 of their cars actually in the top 15, with William Byron, who led a good portion of this race, as he often does at super speedways. He often leads a good number of laps at these types of tracks. He ends up in the top 15. Chase Elliott gets a top 10. Bowman ends up with the top 10. Larson I already mentioned with that top 5. Good for Hendrick. I was watching Justin Haley towards the end. He was running like 3rd at one point. He's a guy who's won a lot of super speedway races in his Xfinity days, and he is a Cup Series winner. Technically speaking, he won that rain-shortened race a couple years ago in the summer at Daytona. So I was watching Justin Haley. He was in contention late, solid top 15 for him, but I'm sure he was looking for a bit more, knowing this was a big opportunity for him to potentially sneak into the playoffs this year. Other drivers late, Bubba finished 17th, Hamlin was 18th. Christopher Bell ended up 22nd after he and Kyle Busch made contact, exiting pit road under green. Busch was trying to shoot underneath Gregson and didn't know Bell was there and spun Bell out, so that sucked. Keselowski, I mentioned, had 2 speeding penalties. Gotta clean the easy things up. He finishes 23rd. I mentioned guys like Reddick, Buescher, Briscoe, Hemrick, all DNF, some with engine failure, some with wrecks. Greg Biffle as well. I noticed Dustin Albino on Twitter mentioned that Greg Biffle in 5 starts this year for NY Racing has had 4 races with major mechanical failures. So that sucks. Anyway, those are your top finishers right there. I want to talk about the broadcast. We'll put this race on the Groovy gauge at the end. We'll talk about the racing. I thought it was a great race, spoiler alert, but the broadcast largely enhanced it today. And there's been very few times this year where I can say that about Fox. From the pre-race show where they've brought back the kind of like race day stage. They did it at Bristol last week. They brought it to Talladega as well. I hope that's here to stay because that's awesome. Seeing the crowds of fans with their signs and stuff behind the TV folks. It just gives this event a much larger event feel, the same way College Game Day does, on ESPN for college football. I hope that stage and everything are here to stay because that enhances the pre-race coverage significantly. And during the race, Fox brought Dale Earnhardt Jr. into the booth alongside Mike Joy and Clint Boyer. NBC let them use him for this one race, and it made a world of difference. Now, Mike Joy's solid still, even as he's into his 70s now. He's been doing this a long, long time. He's still very solid. Clint Boyer, when he's not yucking it up all the time, is occasionally good. At least he brings some energy to the booth. But Dale Earnhardt Jr. today tied everything together. TV is extremely important. I don't want to repeat myself. Every week, 50, 60, 70,000 fans are there in person watching the race. 4+ million others are at home watching on TV. They are forced to watch NASCAR through whatever lens Fox or NBC provide. So TV is extremely important and wields a ton of power. A great moment on track can either be enhanced by TV or completely ruined by the way it's covered. So TV is extremely important, and Dale Earnhardt Jr. was a godsend to Fox today. Obviously one of the greatest Talladega racers of all time. His insight was tremendous. I'll get to that in a moment. But first and foremost, one of my big gripes about Fox Sports in recent years is that often it feels like they're reading off a script. They're just going through the motions. They're looking at the monitors, not looking out front of those big, beautiful windows to see all the action. And so they sometimes miss obvious details. Dale Earnhardt Jr., and I've said this about him at NBC, but it's clear Dale Earnhardt Jr. is on the edge of his seat from start to finish. He is looking out the window, getting the entire picture, seeing every little detail. He is watching the race the way a fan in the grandstands would watch the race, and that comes through. He sounds genuinely happy to be there and enthusiastic about the racing he's watching. Like the way his voice will raise an octave as the intensity on track amps up. It's good stuff. And his insight is usually pretty good as well, but at super speedways especially, there's no one better. He sees things immediately. Like at one point midway through this race, Blaney was being pushed by Bubba Wallace to the lead around the outside. And Dale Jr. was saying, oh, they got to move to the bottom. They're going to move to the bottom right here. And then sure enough, they moved to the bottom. Picked up the inside lane. And then immediately Dale Jr. is like, see, that was a good move because the outside car now leading that draft was the damaged car of Austin Cindric. And immediately that group falls back. Dale Earnhardt Jr. called all of that seconds before it happened. That was just one example that popped into my brain, but there were others during this race where Dale Earnhardt Jr. saw something that either Clint Boyer didn't see or wasn't going to tell us he saw, or that Mike Joy, who's not a race car driver himself, maybe was incapable of explaining to the audience. So Dale Earnhardt Jr. at Talladega especially was a fantastic pick for the TV booth. So he's enthusiastic, brings great energy, ups the intensity with his voice, with the way he calls the races. He's obviously very knowledgeable about Talladega, can call things and see things before they happen. But he's also a great historian of the sport. We know Mike Joy's a great historian, and I thought it was great midway through this race. He and Dale Jr. were kind of bouncing back and forth about the history of Talladega and the Talladega infield and how Talladega Boulevard used to be a runway, all that kind of stuff. Great history that many fans are going to eat up. Dale Earnhardt Jr. is great at that. I mean, you hear it on his podcast pretty much every single week. And actually, it's interesting. I listen to Dale Jr.'s podcast pretty regularly, and he's good there, but it's like he's somehow better on TV when he has absolutely no script and almost like no plan. He's almost better completely off the cuff than he is when he's theoretically planned ahead of time. I don't know, Dale Earnhardt Jr. today just showed how important getting the right talent in the booth, behind the microphone, how important that is. Fox hit a sweet spot 10, 12 years ago when Mike Joy was in his prime, Larry McReynolds was in his prime, Darrell Waltrip was still in his prime as a broadcaster. But once that trio eventually aged and kind of fizzled out, Fox has been unable to recreate that prime TV booth. You can forgive, to an extent, all the commercial breaks. You can even forgive the little glitches or typos, like when I think they had Ross Chastain's number listed as the 42 at one point. You can forgive most of that, or at least ignore a lot of that, if the main trio or 4 people, however many people you have in the booth, if they are on top of their game and painting an intense, action-packed picture for the audience with great historical insight, great foresight into moves that drivers and teams are about to make. If that is top-notch, a lot of the other stuff becomes icing on the cake. And that's how it felt watching today's broadcast with Dale Earnhardt Jr. leading the commentary, leading the analysis part of the commentary at least. It made me hopeful on one hand that great commentary can still exist in the NASCAR Cup Series despite maybe the other shortcomings of the broadcast, but it also made me kind of sad because in a lot of ways I think that's just Dale Jr. He's a unicorn. He's maybe the one and only guy in the industry who can do this, who can elevate a TV booth, elevate a broadcast the way he does, and put all that pressure on one guy. It's not great for the future of the sport. Hopefully somebody else comes along the way before long and can burden some of the load. Anyway, I'll move on. I just know I've ripped against TV a lot this year. And today, aside from the many commercials, which is normal, Fox Talladega, this broadcast was great. I thought the tone was fantastic from pretty much start to finish. So kudos to Fox and their team and NBC for loaning Dale Jr. over. Hopefully Dale Jr. learned some things, but more importantly, hopefully Fox learned some things. This was the tone was great. The vibe was immaculate. Anyway, let's talk again about the vibe on the racetrack. I thought this was a great race. Let's put this thing on the groovy gauge. Third super speedway race of the year, but unlike Atlanta, which you kind of had to watch through gritted teeth knowing what Atlanta used to be, Talladega with its wide open spaces, 2.66 miles of length, you can just sit back and enjoy it the way we've always enjoyed Talladega. There was a familiarity to today's race. Great weather, huge crowd in the grandstands, which was nice to see, and good racing. You could make runs. With a little bit of help, you could pass the leader if you timed the run correctly. A mix of pit strategy, both under green and under caution. A few big wrecks. We never got like a true 15, 20 car big one, which I'm okay with, but a few big wrecks to add to the spectacle and add to the legend, the lore that is Talladega Super Speedway. A few notable wrecks I think are okay, for the casual viewer especially. And an exciting finish. A pass in the final couple hundred yards for the win. All the things that you'd expect to check on your Talladega checklist, we saw here today. So I thought it was a great race. Not going to go down as the all-time best Talladega race ever, but a really good Talladega race. I'm going to give this thing a 95% on the groovy gauge. There's really not much I can gripe about. It wasn't even too long. It was about 3.5 hours long, and that was with a few, of course, big wrecks that took a little bit extra time to clean up. 3.5 hours for 500 miles of Talladega. It's pretty average. So I really can't even complain about the pace of today's race. It was just an all-around, very enjoyable Talladega Super Speedway event. So I'm going to give it a 95%. Share your thoughts down below. How did you feel about today's race? I look forward to hearing your thoughts, hearing your responses. I'm very pleasantly surprised by how well the next-gen car handles in a big pack. With all that turbulent air, all that drafting, it's really performed better this year than I thought it would. Daytona, Atlanta even, and Talladega all have been, I think, very good super speedway events. So I'm very pleased. On that note, we'll wrap this episode up. Thanks for watching. Again, if you're new to the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button. We talk NASCAR pretty much day in, day out here on Out of the Groove. You're not going to miss any future episodes. And as always, a big thank you to my amazing Patreon supporters. I couldn't do this show without your tremendous support each and every month. I greatly and truly appreciate it. We'll be back later this week. Lots of interesting comments from this past weekend that we have to react to and talk about. So I'll see you again very soon. Have a fantastic rest of your weekend, y'all. I'll see you again this week.